This is FLOSS Weekly. I'm Doc Searls. This week, Katherine, Druckman, and I talked to Andy Parsons of the Content Authenticity Initiative. He works for Adobe, but that's his thing, is content authenticity. It is a much bigger topic than I ever thought it was. If it works, all the websites you see can be trusted not to have misinformation in them if all the right things happen. And I think there's actually a fair chance that that will happen. So I'm very enthused about this one, and that is coming up next.
Podcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiT.
This is FLOSS Weekly episode 699, recorded Wednesday, September 21st, 2022. Content Authenticity. This episode of FLOSS Weekly is brought to you by IRL, an original podcast from Mozilla. IRL is a show for people who build AI and people who develop tech policies, hosted by Bridget Todd. This season of IRL looks at AI in real life. Search for IRL in your podcast player. And by Bitwarden, get the password manager that offers a robust and cost-effective solution that can drastically increase your chances of staying safe online. Get started with a free trial of a Teams or Enterprise plan, or get started for free across all devices as an individual user at bitwarden.com/twit. And by Compiler, an original podcast from Red Hat devoted to simplifying tech topics and providing insight for a new generation of IT professionals. Listen to Compiler in your favorite podcast player. Hello again, everybody, everywhere in the world. I am Doc Searls. This is FLOSS Weekly, and I am joined this week by Katherine Druckman herself, who should appear on those who are not visually impaired.
Yes.
Shows looking good.
Thanks.
Welcome.
That I am, the one and only. I hope.
You're still in Houston. I'm still in Bloomington, Indiana. We're only one time zone apart. So our guest this morning, Andy Parsons, he came at your recommendation, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right?
No, I don't think so. I think that was somebody else. Somebody else can claim credit for that. But I am excited because I'm interested in the technology that he's working on. I'm interested in provenance in general, and I think this is going to be a really great conversation.
Yeah, I've had a lot.
While
of
I cannot claim
conversations
credit, I am excited.
Yeah, with other people about authentic data and provenance, which I've heard pronounced both provenance, the French, or provenance, the English. I suppose the Italian would be provenance. Yeah.
I always think provenance because I come from my art history education. That's where that's coming from. So I think in terms of art, provenance and that sort of thing.
Really? Wow.
That's my primary association with that word. Yeah. But that's changing.
Yeah. Well,
as we talk about
the problem
software
with English,
supply
it's
chain
full of optionalities. Yeah. It's made up of other languages and full of that. So I don't want to delay any further because I really want to get going on the show. So our guest this morning is Andy Parsons. He's the senior director of Adobe's Content Authenticity Initiative. It's creating open technologies for a future of verifiably authentic content of all kinds. I'm skipping, it's a long one. Throughout his career, he's worked to empower creative professionals. He's a big believer in the power of community. He ran the Closure Meetup at NYC and organized the New York CTO Club. He founded WorkFrame. I rather like his website, though. I'm looking to find it here. It's because it says he's a saxophonist, husband and dad, lives in Brooklyn. Also an aspiring barbecue pitmaster, cyclist, and wannabe whiskey distiller. So, with all of those out of the way, welcome to the show, Andy.
Thank you, Doc and Katherine. It's a pleasure to be here.
That's great. So, I have to let on that I am I'm a lapsed Brooklyn Dodgers fan because that's how old I am. So I never forgave them for leaving Brooklyn.
Well, don't hold it against me today, Doc.
Yeah, are you lifelong, or are you a Brooklyn person, or you just moved there, or relatively recent?
I consider myself a New Yorker. Yeah, I grew up in Connecticut. I've lived all over the place, but I've been in Brooklyn for 20 plus years. So I think I've earned the mantle of New Yorker.
That does it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the accent's gone, or you could call yourself a New Yorker now. I grew up across the river in New Jersey, so nice. That's Connecticut's nicer. It's a better adjacent state. So tell us about content authenticity, and because suddenly, I don't know if it's your work or somebody's work, but it's suddenly turning into a topic.
Yeah, I hope it's our work, but I will concede that there's a lot of interest around the topic of verifiable media integrity or provenance. I say provenance. I love that you guys started out by debating the pronunciation of the word. Something that comes up all the time. I think historically, Katherine's exactly right. It does come from the art world, and it has broad applicability to what we do in the digital realm. But it's sort of an esoteric SAT word. So if you guys have suggestions for a better one, I am all ears. But for now, it's provenance with my Brooklyn accent. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of interest in this area for a number of reasons, and that we're sort of living at the nexus of, I think over the past several years and frankly decades and centuries, misinformation, the inadvertent sharing of information that's untrue or misleading, and malicious disinformation, which we see more and more of around elections and wars in the world, and then the arrival of like incredibly powerful, week over week, day over day, we see more power coming from the realms of synthetic media and generative media. Those things have all, kind of become conflated. And I think there's urgency around finding solutions to this problem. And it's probably unlikely to be detecting fake media or manipulated media. And instead, it's a matter of focusing our attention on provenance, which is proving truth about how things were made and where it makes sense, who made them and who gets attribution and those kinds of things. So that's what we've been focused on. Doc, you're right. There's a ton of attention from a lot of industry sectors to address the problem. And effectively what we're doing at the Content Authenticity Initiative is exactly that. We're doing it through open source, through open standards in the Linux Foundation, and through Adobe tools. So everything in the Creative Cloud that will be outfitted with the technologies we'll talk about today. But historically, this was started in late 2019. It was announced at Adobe Max, which is Adobe's big creator ecosystem conference. I think that was the last pre-COVID convening. The last 2 years have been remote. And then in 2020, I joined Adobe to basically lead this initiative. And the kind of founding concepts were, as I said, like let's see if we can prove what's true about media, about how it's produced, about who produced it, who gets credit for it, and turn our attention away from synthetic media or deepfake detection, because that's probably an arms race that the good guys are going to lose. And then that has blossomed into a number of efforts, which hopefully we'll get into. One is an organization outside of Adobe called the C2PA. That's a JDF project in the Linux Foundation where standards are being created. There's a big open source effort that my team is working on, and we're beginning to get pull requests and kind of building an early but active, engaged community around making this stuff accessible and easy to implement. And I've said everything about the initiative except what it is. The idea is to capture verifiable facts, if you will. All these words around truth and trust and facts are fraught terms. Again, the limits of the English language, perhaps. But the idea is to capture verifiable information about how something was made, about what ingredients comprise it, and even things like perhaps, what ML training data or model was used to produce something. So we're very interested in that. Obviously, Adobe, powers a lot of creativity in the world. Our tools are used on everything from restaurant menus and PDFs and signatures, and of course, Photoshop and Premiere and tools of creation. So we're very interested in a solution that gives creators credit for their work, but also addresses the kind of scourge of disinfo. So a little bit of a rambly intro, but I hope that gives you a sense of what we're up to.
That was great. I wonder if you can just tell us a little bit more about how it works, and if you could kind of segue also into why open source. I mean, how did this end up becoming an open source project? I think that's obviously something our listeners want to hear about, being FLOSS Weekly. But how did this come about, and how did Adobe get involved?
Yeah, so the CAI, or the Content Authenticity Initiative, was started by us. Got underway in 2020, and again, it recognized two important things, which culminated in the open source work that we released just a couple months ago in June. And those realizations were, this is a long-term problem. It's been with us since the days of Stalin, manipulating photography and removing his enemies from photos, and probably long before that. And we felt that Adobe has an important role to play and a responsibility, given that so much of the world's creative content goes through Adobe tools. Secondly, that it couldn't be an Adobe only solution. That would be, extremely foolish. Leadership at our company knew that early on and said, look, we need to build an industry consortium, maybe a standard, at that time at initiation, and make this something that can involve the interests of everybody from social media to the entire news ecosystem, broadcast, to Adobe tools, Adobe competitors. And you can see where this is going. It therefore needs to be open. Any spec that is created should not be under the umbrella of Adobe or Microsoft or the BBC or any particular member, but rather in an open ecosystem, in a nonprofit. We found a very comfortable warm home in the Linux Foundation, of course. And then ultimately, we wanted to empower engineers building provenance solutions into their tools. And ideally, what's better than a capitalistic motivation to build a startup and raise money and make money? We wanted to make it easy for them to pull in provenance technologies. Why use Adobe open source? It's the very same code that's running in Photoshop and other Creative Cloud tools. And, in the interest of adoption, to answer your question directly, Katherine, nothing spurs adoption than free, permissive licensing. And that's why we took this approach.
So I have a whole bunch of questions queued up here, but while I'm juggling tabs on my desktop, I have to let people know first that this episode of FLOSS Weekly is brought to you by IRL, an original podcast from Mozilla. IRL is a show for people who build AI and people who develop tech policies. It's hosted by Bridget Todd, and this season IRL looks at AI in real life. Who can AI help? Who can it harm? The show features fascinating conversations with people who are working to build more trustworthy AI. For example, there's an episode about how our world is mapped with AI. The data missing from those maps tells as much of a story as the maps themselves. You hear all about the people who are working to fill those gaps and take control of the data. There's another episode about gig workers who depend on apps for their livelihood. It looks at how they're pushing back against algorithms that control how much they get paid and seeking new ways to gain power over data to create better working conditions. For political junkies, there are episodes about the role that AI plays when it comes to the spread of misinformation and hate speech around elections, a huge concern for democracies around the world. The latest episode I listened to this morning opens actually with a sad story about a guy who's lost his wife from misdiagnosis because of a melanoma, because all of the existing expertise on this in terms of pictures was of lightly complected people. His wife is African-American and she died. It's really bad, but he's taken control of that thing and filling AI with much better information, much better pictures, kind of an open source angle to it as well. So I highly recommend going and checking that out. So search for IRL in your podcast player. We'll include a link in the show notes. My thanks to IRL for their support. Okay, so Andy, you mentioned the Linux Foundation. It seems like we run into the Linux Foundation everywhere and they jump ahead of everything. So what is the connection there with the Linux Foundation? I mean, the other day, for example, they announced an intent to form a foundation around something, not this particular thing, but I'm wondering what that connection is.
Yeah. So, I think what we wanted to avoid in the early days of opening this and making it, again, outside the umbrella of any particular company or contributor was things like the intent to form a proxy for a decision that might be made in the future. We wanted to avoid that kind of thing. And within the Linux Foundation is housed a project structure called the JDF, so Joint Development Foundation. I think probably the most well-known, besides our project, selfishly, the most well-known JDF project is probably the Alliance for Open Media that focuses on video codecs and other things. And it's effectively a just add water sort of way to found a standards development organization. So rather than reinventing the wheel, inventing an IP policy or adopting one involving armies of attorneys to set up a nonprofit, you can go to the Linux Foundation and the folks who run the JDF in particular and say, we want to form a standards development organization. We want extremely permissive W3C compatible licensing. And you choose from their kind of menu of options for forming the organization, and then you're ready to go. So rather than, months or multiple months of setting up the organization. Within a couple of weeks, we were ready to convene and begin and read the IP policy to participants. So I don't know of anything else. I'm not a standards historian by any means, but I don't know of anything else that makes bootstrapping an organization so straightforward. And again, feeling the urgency that we all felt in forming this thing, we didn't want to kind of focus our energies on the setup, but rather forming the task forces and the technical working group and starting to get some standards down on paper. So the Linux Foundation was the exact right home for this.
Trying to hand the ball to Katherine.
Sorry. So I'm actually looking at the tools themselves, and I think our listeners would be anxious to hear a little bit of an explanation about each of the open source tools that you provide. If you go to content-authenticity.org, I noticed you have a JavaScript SDK. There's a command line tool, a Rust SDK. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? Why Rust? I thought that was an interesting choice, and you mentioned it actually in our pre-show notes. I thought maybe I'd like to hear about that actually.
Definitely. Let me rewind a little bit, Katherine, answer a question you left hanging that he didn't answer, which is how does this work? And then I think from that, we can, it'll be clearer why we created these three tools and even why Rust. So, as I described, the idea behind provenance is to capture verifiable information when an asset is made. So imagine in a Photoshop workflow or any video editing workflow, you bring in lots of what we call ingredients, you mix them together, and then you export a final master or a final JPEG or a PNG or what have you. And the idea is you effectively develop a graph of the contributors to that content and what tools were used. Now, I should make it clear, all of this is opt-in. This is not intended or in fact, there are countermeasures to make sure this can't be used for surveillance. Identity isn't required. In fact, the minimal claim that is made in one of these cryptographically signed manifests, as we call them, is just a timestamp, maybe a thumbnail of what the media looked like before, and so you can compare it with the after. But the idea is to capture everything that a creator or a photographer or a news organization wants about how the thing was made. So, for example, there's a kind of a broad spectrum of use. One would be, let's say, a creator using Adobe tools or other tools who's minting NFTs or trying to monetize their work in some other way. You want to get credit for your work. Doesn't mean you can't have pseudonymous ID, and we can get much more deeply into ID. I know that's been a topic on other shows. Identity, specifically. You can get credit for your work, but you can be Banksy, you can be Andy Parsons or Doc Searls. And you want to attach your identity in some form or another to the media itself. The other end of the spectrum is maybe you're a conflict photojournalist, and the worst thing for your personal safety would be to reveal anything about GPS coordinates or the device you're using, or of course your actual identity. And therefore just a timestamp is required there. But that conflict photojournalist might want to show what edits were made in an editing tool to make sure that work conforms, for example, to AP or New York Times standards for information integrity. And we can exist anywhere on that spectrum, from purely focusing on identity and attribution all the way to transparency about what something is and how it was made, and making sure that a police car wasn't added or removed from a photo or video. So these tools allow us to do all of those things. And the trust model is based on a digital signature. I listened to one of the episodes you did with Dave Huseby, who pointed out that, X509 digital signatures have been around for many decades, proven. We need not necessarily look at blockchains and new ways to create digital signatures and proofs. And why not use a decades old hardened proven technology? So we effectively create a digital signature, which of course Adobe has quite a lot of experience with. We sign and bind the manifest, which contains all those facts I described, to the media itself, so that it inextricably travels wherever that media may go. And that's the idea behind the CAI and the C2PA standard. It addresses that for a number of file types. It even covers streaming. And in the future, I think it will also address live streaming, so broadcast and video calls, where you might have somebody for good or deleterious purposes, appearing to be someone that they are not, whether it's a cartoon character or a politician. There's a lot of relevance for provenance to those kinds of situations as well. So, turning to the open source tools, And the spec, by the way, is open, free. There's no IP. It's available to anybody. Most of us wouldn't want to read a deep technical spec, just like we would like to grab OpenSSL and not read all the SSL RFCs. So we hope that the Adobe open source will be, one of a constellation of open source tools that make it very straightforward to do this. And as you pointed out, it comes in 3 flavors. One is a JavaScript SDK that lets you effectively drop a few lines of JavaScript on a web page or into a web-based mobile app. And any images or soon videos that come through in that context that have provenance data will display it. You're showing an example there, perfect timing. So that little eye icon represents the presence of C2PA provenance data. And you can click on it and reveal a high-level summary of, in this case, we're showing what ingredients were mixed in, who's getting credit for this, who's signing for it. Could be an organization, could be a synonymous ID, it could be Andy Parsons. And then we can learn a little bit about what comprises that particular asset. So that's what the JavaScript SDK does. It allows you to do this in any web-based application of any kind. There is a thing called the C2PA tool, which is a command line app that could be shelled out to from a service. We have folks doing that. In fact, Adobe Stock takes this approach. So I think some number of hundreds of thousands of Adobe Stock assets go through this process every day as they're downloaded. And we have sort of a last mile provenance edition that uses that tool. But you and your listeners might also be familiar with something called EXIF tool, which is an open source project made by a gentleman named Phil Harvey, who many of us in the photo ecosystem, Phil is a hero in the open source ecosystem. EXIF tool is pretty much, the clearinghouse tool for anything you want to do with EXIF data or image metadata in general. And we'd like to see C2PA tool or something like it be that for digital cryptographic provenance. So it does all the things like show you, different kinds of disclosure about what data has been signed into the asset. It will allow you to create test certificates so you can play around with making your own cryptographically signed C2PA metadata and everything in between, so via the command line. And then the third offering is, in the interest of convenience, the C2PA tool and the JavaScript SDK are kind of purpose-built for specific scenarios. For example, the JavaScript SDK has some UI built into it. You can skin it and add CSS any way you want, but it's basically meant to replicate a UI like we just saw a moment ago. And the lower level SDK allows you to do whatever you like. So it does all the heavy lifting. It implements kind of the tricky parts of the spec, which involve things like CBOR, a variety of cryptographic signature types that are all implemented. So it's very straightforward to bring that into your app, to link it in. And this is where Rust comes in handy. And that we've seen that work and proven that it's pretty facile in iOS, on Android, really any kind of language binding you would like to create. And, largely thanks to Mozilla, of course, originators of the Rust language itself, but also there continues to be this rich ecosystem of tooling from Mozilla and now with lots of other contributors to make bindings to other languages really straightforward. So, in short, why Rust? If you take something that has, really deep memory protections without garbage collection, which isn't portable across platforms and probably not viable on cameras and mobile devices, and then you connect that to bindings for any language you might be using, be it Python or C or C++, or Swift, you have this really interesting tool set that runs fast, that has, memory safety, like many other statically compiled languages, but without the dangers, of course, of something like C or C++, and a very small distributable binary or library. So it offers a tremendous amount of flexibility. I would say, in my experience, and this is mostly me proxying for my team who writes Rust code every day, there's a learning curve, but it pays off in orders of magnitude of productivity and lack of bugs. So we're very pleased with Rust. It's sort of, Adobe's exploring Rust in other areas. There are many large companies who are taking advantage of Rust. And I just couldn't be more pleased with our personal experience using it for this project.
That's a lot. There's a lot of great info in there. Well, there's always a learning curve, isn't there? But I'm wondering specifically, you mentioned the developer experience. I wonder about adoption. I actually wonder about adoption from the end user perspective, but also the developer perspective. I know, I've noticed. I read the New York Times article about this that you linked to on the site as a case study, and I'm wondering where developers and end users can see this in the wild, and what kind of the uptake is on all of this.
Yeah, it's a great question, an essential question. I'll start by describing what ultimate success looks like for all of us. I would say even for society at large, to have the transparency that the Content Authenticity Initiative and the C2PA standard enable, to have that available to everybody everywhere. Now, when I say it's early days, I'm saying that there's a lot more work to do on the adoption side. There's a gentleman on my team who has decades of experience as a conflict photojournalist himself. His name is Santiago Lyon. He speaks quite a lot and very well about the CAI and the C2PA. Santiago also ran the photo organization at the Associated Press for 15 years in a VP role there. So he really understands the urgency and the necessity for information integrity when it comes to media, especially in this environment in which we live with social media, where things are shared with impunity because they might fit someone's worldview without really pausing to take a look at what something is and whether it's trustworthy or not. So we have made tremendous inroads in the kind of information ecosystem and generally in news. If you look at the roster of, I think we're up to 800 plus members of the CAI, this large community, sort of centered around open source and conversations about provenance and its applications. You'll see names like AP and Reuters and AFP, camera manufacturers. What you may not see yet is the kind of end user facing kind of last mile social media sites and other kinds of sites where news can be shared from the BBC to media feeds and things like that. And, all I can say about that is stay tuned. We're working on those. And the ecosystem of, smaller companies and startups, many of which you've heard of, many of which you haven't, is very rich and active. So we have a Discord channel. We have a membership that's very easy to be part of the CAI. You just go give us your logo and some information about what you intend to do, and you can be party to all of our free events, get some support from the Adobe team on the open source side, and there are other benefits. So I would say it's early, but we're seeing signs of like a really rich ecosystem. We're doing things pretty much right to my eye, Katherine, but I don't think that's why this is going to be successful. I think, again, that everybody in the orbit around misinformation and attribution for creators feels the same urgency that we do to figure out at least a foundational layer of trustworthiness to, add to the internet itself. And that's why they're involved. And we're getting a lot of great feedback about the tools. There are dozens of implementations underway with some of those big name partners and some of the lesser known companies as well. So we are beginning the journey, we have not ended it yet.
So I have a question about identity, which I think is hopefully an important one, or maybe just a coincidental one. But first, I have to let everybody know that this episode of FLOSS Weekly is brought to you by Bitwarden. Bitwarden is the only open source cross-platform password manager that can be used at home, at work, or on the go, and is trusted by millions. With Bitwarden, you can securely store credentials across personal and business worlds. Every Bitwarden account begins with the creation of a personal vault. With Bitwarden's username generator, you can integrate with the following popular email forwarding services that are also open source: Simple Login, Anonaddy, Firefox Relay, and now Fastmail. That makes adding another layer of security and privacy easier than ever. When using Bitwarden to generate a new username, the option to create an email alias is presented with a subselection for choosing your preferred service. Enter the API key for your individual account. With the chosen service, select the desired options, and what's generated a new alias is instantly registered to your account. Using unique usernames, email addresses, and passwords for every account is a powerful method for increasing internet security and privacy, and adds protection to logins in the face of data breaches and leaks. This feature is available on the Web Vault, desktop app and browser extensions with mobile planned for a future release. And for those customers that use Bitwarden to generate TOTP codes, they can access it more easily on a dedicated screen on their mobile app. Bitwarden is a must. Need for your business is fully customizable and adapts to your business needs. Use Bitwarden Send, a fully encrypted method to transmit sensitive information, whether text or files. Generate unique and secure passwords for every site with enterprise-grade security that's GDPR, CCPA, HIPAA, and SOC 2 compliant. Their end-to-end encrypted vault helps mitigate phishing attacks. And Bitwarden has recently added even more enterprise capability by adding SCIM, or SCIM support, to make it even easier to provision and manage users. Their Teams organization is $3 a month per user. Share private data securely with coworkers across departments or the entire company. Enterprises can use Bitwarden's Enterprise Organization Plan for $5 a month per user. Individuals can use their basic free account forever for an unlimited number of passwords or upgrade anytime to their premium account for less than $1 a month. The family organization option gives up to 6 users premium features for only $3.33 a month. At TWiT, we're fans of password managers. Bitwarden is the only open source cross-platform password manager that can be used at home, on the go, or at work, and is trusted by millions of individuals, teams, and organizations worldwide. Get started with a free trial of a Teams or Enterprise plan, or get started for free across all devices as an individual user at bitwarden.com/twit. That's bitwarden.com/twit. Okay, so I wanted to talk identity because we've had a lot of guests on the show, and full disclosure, I'm involved with it too. So is my wife, with the whole SSI, self-sovereign identity, verifiable credentials approach to personal identity, where you don't have an ID, you have something that says, I have tickets to the game, I went to this school, here's where to find my what, where it's minimum disclosure for constrained uses, justifiable parties, is a whole set of rules. And it seems to me this is very close to that. And I'm wondering what the overlap is. If I hadn't thought about it before, that, wow, data can be making a presentation of a verifiable credential that can be authenticated somehow. And that data could be, this is a real source. This is a real story. This is not BS here. I can trust this. And then you can unpack it with that little eye that you see in the corner of a web page. So tell me more, but you're nodding. So I imagine there's a connection there.
Yeah. There's a connection. I mean, full disclosure, it's something that we talk about a lot in the standards organization, and it's not a solved problem, but you're totally right, Doc. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of overlap between, general public key cryptography, the notion of decentralized IDs, which was, I think, recently graduated to a W3C recommendation after some churn around focusing it on kind of standard clear ways to create DID resolution methods and things like that. But verifiable credentials are super interesting. I mean, the topic is extremely germane to what we do with content authenticity, because, as you said, age-old example, you shouldn't have to show your government-issued ID to get into a bar. You need only prove that you're allowed to go into that bar or whatever. And similarly with sort of disclosure and verifiable presentations, which of course are part of the VC spec. I think, we have a ways to go to make true SSI accessible to consumers. And I'd love to hear your opinion on that as well. I'm sure you're pretty close to it. Currently, to get ready for that, we do use the DID document that is retrieved and VCs in the format of the C2PA metadata. So sealed into that chunk of CBOR is a DID and various verifiable credentials representing some of the data you described. So we're on a road to get there. Building an ecosystem around issuers and holders and verifiers specifically for disinfo and credentialing is a ways away, but we definitely want to. I should have mentioned up front, what we're doing with the CAI and the C2PA specifically intends as a guiding principle to invent the least required novel technology, right? We don't want to reinvent PKI. We don't want to invent new blockchains if that's not necessary. And we certainly don't want to stick our noses in identity, which has a long history, a fraught history, but a history. So issues of reputation, identity, verifiable credentials, we want to adopt the good work that's being done in many organizations, including the W3C. So there is overlap. I think in the coming years, you will see self-sovereignty of private keys. So I don't need an organization to proxy for my identity. For example, in Photoshop, currently, Adobe will effectively authenticate you using standard means. You can OAuth your Instagram account and connect various accounts. Again, I'm not using the word identity here because these are accounts, not identity. And eventually, other kinds of verifiable identity that might involve, physical verification, waving your hand in front of your face with a certificate issuer, holding up a government ID. So at least, even if you don't trust me, Andy Parsons, you know that I am who I say I am, according to some third-party KYC style customer. So all the things I just mentioned are part and parcel to, I think, the eventual broad adoption of DIDs and VCs. And we want to be ready for that when it's accessible to consumers so that I can be me or I can be Banksy. I can reveal only information that's necessary for you to verify and frankly decide for yourself whether to trust an image or a video or a social media post.
Wow. There's so much there.
There is.
You were actually twisting my mind even as you're speaking about how to make all this identity stuff succeed. My first thought is you may be further ahead than the whole identity world is by working on your stuff, because you're talking about verifiably authentic data and verifiably authentic sources. That may be a lower hurdle than trying to get the whole world to start waving verifiable credentials in front of some relying party that has no idea what you're doing. There's I think an issue there with the entire DID identity world going to self-sovereignty and all that stuff is that the norms are the flywheels of business as usual and of the norms that we've had predating the net. You carry a bunch of government issued IDs and other, business issued IDs. We call them IDs. They're not IDs. They're documents, but they're in little rectangles that are plastic in our pockets. And we present those when we get into Costco or we get into a bar or some other thing. And that's a norm that is very, very well established. How do you get past that? And I think the issue is UI. The issue is somebody has to invent the thing that mothers the necessity, where you take one look at it and say, I have to have it. My example for that is the smartphone. Smartphones were around for a long time before Apple figured a way to make it easy, and where you take one look at that and you said, I had to have it. I remember people saying, nobody's ever going to want a phone that doesn't have a keyboard on it. Well, guess what? Apple's phone didn't have a keyboard on it, but it had apps. And all of a sudden we're living in that world, and we've been living in there ever since. And somebody else may come up with something better. I don't know, but so let me twist this a little bit to going down the route of provenance. I think the high hope here is that every website that has a stake in reputation is going to want that little I in the corner of the web page, of every web page. That's kind of like an RSS used to be, and I'd like to see the RSS symbol to go back on there, because I think RSS is a wonderful thing, and I'd love to have Dave Weiner on the show later because he's doing great stuff there. But we need to have that there, because then you'll know, even if it's not quite real, you can track it down. And it'd be easier for everybody. I also have another thought, which is, and this is really off base, but I think it's an interesting one. In my own project that started at the Berkman Center at Harvard a long time ago, we came up with an idea called Emancipate. The idea with Emancipate is you can throw money at anybody you want for whatever you want. And so, for example, at a whim, or you can program it in. I just have it automatically. I'll record everything I'll have my own record of everything that I've listened to and I've watched. Then I can voluntarily throw money back at it in a way that gets escrowed at some trustable place. But I can cascade it down through sources. So, for example, with reporting, I can say, boy, I really like that. Andy had that. And then his sources were this or this or this. Or with music, because I know you play the sax, let's say I like that piece of music and you're on that and I want the band paid, right? Or I want the composer paid. And I can put that into there. And that's an idea that's been laying around for 17 years and nobody's adopted it. But I think there may be a way to do it through the schema, the ontology. I'm not sure what the right word for it is, for what you're scaffolding up there. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are about all that. It's a lot.
It is a lot. How much time do we have? We have another 2 hours. Talking, Katherine. It's like
we have about 20 minutes and one more ad in there. So
back at you, Doc, because now you're twisting my mind, and there's a lot, and I'm going to miss some of it because gears are turning. So first of all, I want to back up to a critical point. I couldn't agree more that the barrier for adoption of SSI and sane ID identity systems is UX, like 100%. User experience it has a long way to go, to put it mildly. And I think, regardless of how you feel about the NFT or the cryptocurrency ecosystem, which are separate things, or the involvement of blockchain as a tool to enable other kinds of, reasonable and justified decentralization, without good UX to access these things and actually exercise your sovereignty over your private keys, and also a baseline understanding of what these things are, I think we're doomed. Now, we're not actually doomed because there are good companies working on these problems, but it has a long, long way to go. Witness the simple idea that many NFT collectors, and as you would imagine, we on the Content Authenticity Initiative talk to people in the art world who are making the transition to digital art and exploring ways to be compensated and have proper attribution in all sorts of new kind of types of mixed media art. Some of them believe, as they've been led to believe, that the NFTs are in the wallet, like the information is in the computer. What a wallet is, as you both know, is a way to steward private keys and unlock things on blockchains that live in a decentralized way all over the place. But relatively simple ideas like that, I think, number one, I don't think consumers necessarily need to or do care about decentralization until it comes to, data stewardship and big companies owning your data. And we could spend one of our many more hours just on that. But again, for utility and usage and adoption, it 100% comes down to UX. And that is, in fact, why Photoshop takes it makes some assumptions about the way people want to use this. Because if you want to use content credentials, which is the name we're using for the more creator accessible ideas behind the C2PA standard, if you want to add content credentials, it needs to be as easy as possible. And moreover, it needs to not impede your standard workflow. It can't slow you down in any way. You need to understand what you're doing in a responsible way so you don't accidentally share identity in a public way, but it needs to be as seamless as possible. And I think that's where, wallet software and cold and hot storage and things like that will enable DID lack. So there's a long way to go there, number one. Provenance in general, I agree with you also, like it for this to be successful, it does need to be ubiquitous. Like you should come to expect it. And that's why we started with engaging with news organizations and creators of content and Adobe competitors and Adobe tools that we make, so that kind of the supply chain, starting with cameras, has provenance built into it, so that at the other end, on social media and other places, you can expose it as soon as there's a critical mass. And there will be a critical mass in the next couple of years. And I think it really matters most because this data travels with the asset no matter where it goes. You could argue, and you'd be right to say, does the BBC or the New York Times really need to prove the provenance of an asset on its own web properties where you already have an SSL certificate and a lock in your browser? No, probably not. If you trust the BBC's sourcing methods and you trust the BBC as a conduit of information, then that's good enough. But as soon as that asset leaves the BBC, and an asset here could be a contextualized image or video that has text with it. It could be just a video that ends up on Twitter. Then you really need to understand its provenance, where it came from. And at the bare minimum, to be able to cryptographically prove that something that purports to come from the BBC actually did come from the BBC. So that's kind of the low-hanging fruit for the ubiquity you described and having that icon everywhere where it matters. And there was so much more in what you said. I forgot what, I'm not even sure where to go next, but those are some.
It is too much. And I think actually we should probably talk later anyway.
Definitely.
We have a few seconds after the show, but one question I have is like, what's the path to success in this exactly, or as you're imagining it out? Because I would love to see that little eye on as many sites as possible that traffic in trustworthy information, and kind of a wheat and chaff threshing that will happen by nature once that comes up. And I think you've got a fairly bounded set of concerns here. You're not trying to, like, the problem with SSI is trying to take on the entire identity world. It's a tough one, but you've got something much more bounded. What's going to take? Is it going to take the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal joining this CAI or what? Maybe they already have, and I don't even know it.
They have indeed.
Good.
So there's wow. a broad spectrum of participants in the CAI. You both should join as well. It's open to individuals and organizations, really anybody interested in the space who has something to offer or learn. And I think that's pretty much everybody everywhere. But I think, the path to success, we're well past the starting line. As I said earlier, it by design, it started with gaining a consensus across industry, human rights. I should note here that, this is not intended, nor is it a bunch of big tech companies getting together to be the arbiter of trust. The CAI at its fundamental kind of founding ideology is about transparency, not making judgment calls. So, we would prefer that any platform or app not make judgment calls about its media in general. This is a broad generalization, but instead push the transparency all the way to the consumer. And that's what that eye icon is for. The eye doesn't indicate that something is trustworthy. It's not like a Twitter blue check mark saying, Andy is verified. It's simply a way to say there's more here. Should you wish to learn about what this actually is, there's more here. And if you're compelled to explore it, it's right there, a click or a tap away. Or, a retina implant away, whatever it's going to be in the metaverse. But, I think moreover, the accessibility, which is also a guiding principle, also has two facets. It's number one, accessibility to engineers, developers, product people, designers who want to explore this and implement it, but also accessibility geographically. And that means low cost, implementation on low cost devices, on apps that can run on, not the latest generation of iPhone 25s. And that's something that we focus a lot of this kind of early ecosystem attention on, is to make sure that this code that we're writing can run on those constrained devices. But there are other kinds of constrained devices that are newer, that are in the hands of photojournalists. They might be mirrorless cameras. They might be, the number of manufacturers that are outfitting AFP and the AP and Reuters and others with, the instruments to capture fact and tell the truth and tell stories about what's going on in the world. So we want to enable them as well. So that's all on the supply side. So as we think about success, there's like making sure we have plenty of supply of provenance enabled media. Then there's all the things that exist in news production pipelines and creative pipelines and agencies and, digital experience platforms that touch that media, change it, carry through the metadata. So we need to make sure that at a minimum, they don't alter it in a way that isn't C2PA compliant, that doesn't have the data continue to be bound to the bytes of the asset. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is to embrace all of the platforms, websites, mobile apps, operating systems, and eventually browsers, right? We want to push this down to the metal, so to speak, not have every mobile app in the world need to implement CAI open source from Adobe, but rather to have these facilities in the mobile OS itself, because that's more secure. It can take advantage of hardware security, and it can be available. If you want it, it's right there. And it's the same code baked into operating systems. So that's all to say we have a long way to go, but success looks like penetration across all those facets, so that makers of applications and purveyors of information, be it video, photos, audio, 3D in the metaverse, whatever that is, have access to it and begin to use it. We have good early signals that consumers want this, and that they do understand that this is about transparency, not about judgment, and portraying you can trust these entities, you can't trust these entities. And there's a lot more work that has to go in there. So, on that last front, what we are doing is spinning up a lot of user research, both at Adobe and in the C2PA, funded by C2PA members, funded by Adobe, to understand how to get this message across to consumers, because it's not a straightforward message. And frankly, it's not one that we've needed before, which is to say, there's an icon here, there's a way to explore, there's a way to understand what this is, rather than having interventions that say things like, you haven't even read this article, Andy, are you sure you want to share it? Instead, if I do share it, even on messaging systems and end-to-end encrypted messaging systems, I'm sharing it with the context. from which it came. And that's critically important and not straightforward to understand. So in service of that, we are also making efforts around a new kind of media literacy, really, which is be skeptical of everything. There was a time when phishing attacks were very poorly understood by consumers. You mentioned that earlier. And now, many people, if not most, across all age groups, would think twice or not even think about opening something that looks like it came from Citibank but has a weird URL or a broken certificate in a browser. So we want to get the media literacy level of our children, our grandchildren, our grandparents, our parents across geographies to be ready to embrace this when it becomes ubiquitous. So there's a lot to do. There are a lot of people involved and very interested parties involved, including human rights concerns, who want to make sure that we safeguard, founding principles like privacy and safety.
Wow, boy, I'm typing furiously in our back channel, and
I know.
Katherine too, because there's so much we can unpack here, and we're running short on time, which means I have to tell everybody that this episode of FLOSS Weekly is brought to you by Compiler, an original podcast from Red Hat devoted to simplifying tech topics and providing insight for a new generation of IT professionals. It's hosted by Angela Andrews and Brent Simoneau. Compiler closes the gap between those who are new to technology and those behind the inventions and services shaping our world. Compiler brings together stories and perspectives from the industry and simplifies its language, culture, and movements in a way that's fun, informative, and guilt-free. Do you want to stay on top of tech without the time spent in original podcasts from Red Hat? Compiler presents perspectives, topics, and insights from the tech industry free from jargon and judgment. They want to discover where technology is headed beyond the headlines and create a place for new IT professionals to learn, grow, and thrive. Compiler helps people break through barriers and challenges, turning code into community at all levels of the enterprise. In one episode, they cover the great stack debate. The software stack is like an onion or a sheet cake or a lasagna, or is it? It's often described as having layers that sit on top of each other, but the reality is much more complicated, and learning about it can help any tech career. The Great Stack Debate is the first episode of Compiler's series on the software stack. They explore each layer of the stack and what it's like to work on them and how they come together into a whole application. Another episode covers, are we as productive as we think? The pressure to balance productivity with passion projects, personal responsibilities, or just with the need to rest is challenging. Their team spoke with tech-minded creators in the productivity space on how to achieve full focus and how to make time for work, relaxation, and creativity. By the way, I've checked out the one on the Great Stack Debate. It's really good. The stack is not just a stack. It's more like, Tetris or something like that. We need a different metaphor for it. Learn more about Compiler at red.ht/twit. Listen to Compiler in your favorite podcast player. We'll also include a link in the show notes. My thanks to Compiler for their support. So, Katherine, you had one queued up.
I do. Yeah. So here's what's particularly interesting to me. This seems to me to be at least a partial solution, a partial technical solution to what is a cultural problem. And while you mentioned earlier that you don't consider it to have the same meaning as, for example, a Twitter check mark, you're not necessarily verifying something in the same way. It seems to me that you still need to build trust with end users ultimately, especially non-technical people who may have zero understanding of what cryptographic signing is and any of these things. So I'm wondering how you approach educating consumers, or if that's even, if you see that as your role. I'm curious to know, how you envision getting buy-in from the rest of the world, to trust that they can rely on this evidence of provenance for various media.
I let it, Katherine. It's probably the hardest problem or problem area that we face in adoption.
Hold on. I'm gonna cut in. Your mic was cut on my side. I'm gonna have you start again. Okay.
Yes.
That's Andy. Andy, right? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So, Katherine, you're pointing out, one of the greatest challenges we face as we move ahead. So, first of all, it's certainly not only Adobe who is responsible ultimately for educating consumers and the public and fact checkers. That's a that's a responsibility that should, and I think is beginning to be spread across many companies and nonprofit interests and universities and others that we talk with frequently. And I also think you're 100% correct to point out that this sort of, sociological implications of digital provenance and its ubiquity, I would say even geopolitical implications, when you have obviously, state-funded actors who will be involved in some way, good or bad, in these ecosystems that develop. Those are really gnarly problems, and I would be, just a complete fool to tell you that we have that all figured out. I think this is an emergent ecosystem. Trust is important. I just want to not gloss over that too quickly here. So when I talk about the blue check mark, that's something that Twitter might be communicating to its constituents, saying, we believe Andy is who he says he is, and you can trust that too because you trust us. It is important to trust the signer of C2PA metadata in these manifests, and the trust is rooted there. Doesn't mean you need to know the person or the agency or the organization, but it does mean you need to trust the system, which I think is what you're pointing out. And that's why it's important that all of this be open. None of it can be closed. None of it can be proprietary. It can't be bound up in IP with any company or companies, and it can't cost anything. So, trust the force, read the source, or whatever the saying is in open source. Like that's an important part of the solution. Now, granted, it doesn't necessarily touch consumers, but neither did the development of the lock in browsers. There was a time that I think maybe we're all old enough to remember. I certainly am. Where there were more than two browsers and more than two, underlining browser SDKs that everybody used. And over time, thanks again to Mozilla, there became a ubiquity of the lock, a certificate authority ecosystem, so that, there was the CAB forum invented so that we could trust the certificates that ship with browsers. That's all technical, esoterica, but ultimately it resulted in people being able to trust that at least the vehicle for them sending their social security numbers and financial instruments back and forth to websites was secure, by some definition of secure. And we want to do the same thing. So it's a giant nut to crack to do this across geographies, economies, and different kinds of individuals. But success, back to Doc's earlier question, does look like ubiquity and understanding. And it does require all those parties to be fully plugged in, including universities. One of the things we are doing at Adobe is funding the development of curricular materials that we will give away, addressing the broad topic of media literacy, but kind of decorated with a very specific concept of media provenance, which we think is going forward one of the most critical skills for consumers to have.
Wow. I'm looking at how little time we have left, and I'm wondering, I want to touch something that's a little bit of a third rail. It may not be for you because you may be isolated from it, which is the authenticity of the way a website appears when in fact it has a mountain of cookies coming in to your browser. Some of those are from Adobe, and then your personal information gets auctioned off somewhere. And I'm wondering whether that figures it all into your work, or not, because I have not been able to get a single reporter to touch that third rail because there's too much money in it. But I'm kind of famous for being an annoyance on that topic. So I'm wondering if you're willing to touch that or not, or maybe you're so isolated from it, it doesn't matter.
I think I'm isolated from it, and the CI is isolated from it. I will say that in the specification and in some, sometimes very vigorous conversations in the standards development organization, we do talk a lot about kind of phone home kind of scenarios where it's like, can some provenance live on the server? And we've taken very careful actions to make sure that none of that is required. There's no scenario here where any server or company or cloud-based system needs to touch any of your data, of course, including your identity. Now, that doesn't mean that, someone couldn't build something on top of the open standard that is effectively DRM, that does all sorts of, behavior tracking. We neither encourage that nor preclude its possibility. And again, this is outside of Adobe, kind of outside of the CAI in particular, but certainly we want to make sure, and I think we've done a pretty good job on the standard side to make sure that a perfectly viable provenance system can be built on these specifications using our open source code that doesn't require any cookies or trafficking with servers whatsoever. So that is a hallmark. It's absolutely required, given the ubiquity that we talked about earlier. having every consumer everywhere, every piece of media having provenance manifests cryptographically attached. We want to make sure that this cannot become a massive surveillance system for states or others.
Wow, we're just about out of time. And I think that you've introduced so many incredibly important topics here. Provenance and authenticity. I mean, what could be bigger issues? Yeah. Speaking as an old reporter here, then where did you get that information? Right, exactly. And can you trust it? And you're talking about context as well. And here in the physical world, we know what that is. It's very simple and most of it's visible. But online, not only is it not, it's too easily gamed at this stage. So we're just about out of time. We always end with several questions, or basically two basic. Well, the first one: is there anything we haven't asked that you'd like us to have asked, and you could answer quickly?
Well, we didn't talk about barbecue, Doc. Maybe if you'll ever have me back, we can touch on that. But no, I think we've covered, to some good degree of depth, all the topics, and there's so much more to talk about. But
well, I spent 20 years in North Carolina, and I got a lot to say about that. And then Katherine's from Texas, which is probably a more legitimate claim to barbecue. So we should talk about that. And actually, we say this to almost everybody. We definitely should have you back, and it has been great having you here. Oh, before we go, what are your favorite text editor and scripting language, if you have those? That may not be part of your job, but
I obviously answer Python for scripting, and nothing earth-shattering here. But I am a VS Code convert from Vim.
Interesting.
Oh, excellent! Very good, very good in the VI family. So thanks again, man. This has been great having you on the show.
Thank you both. It's been a pleasure, and I do hope to come back and talk further.
Yeah, great. Fantastic. So, Katherine, wow. I
was
think
so
we took
good.
more
I'm
notes.
so glad I got to be a part of this. I was just listening and absorbing and learning. I think so much from this that I'm glad I got to do this one.
Yeah, I think we have more. I think there's more in the back channel here between us on the back to TWiT back channel. I didn't check that often because we were too busy with this, and
I know
you had too many irrelevant thoughts about PowerPoint and Photoshop and stuff like that. I think if he succeeds, it does change the world. I mean, because what do we want? We want to know if this stuff is real or not, right? I mean, that's a simple enough thing, and
it's an ambitious goal, but incredibly valuable. It's and I think so coming from my perspective, so if I just quickly plug, I have a new job now. I'm an open source evangelist at Intel.
Oh, we did.
And I'm
plugs.
Thinking, I know, we didn't do that, but I guess I just did. But I spend a lot of time these days thinking about open source security, software supply chains, and having this conversation really kind of drives home that I feel like the phrase of this decade is already supply chain. Like that is it is so important in everything that we do is provenance and tracing things authentically. I think it's it's a conversation I hope to be more a part of, and I'm incredibly interested.
Well, to complete the plug, in case people missed it or are not reading your lower third, you're working for
yes,
Intel.
There we go. Oh, yes,
visit
Intel.
Tell us about that.
Oh, sure. So Intel is heavily involved in open source software. And being new to Intel, I think hopefully you will see a lot more from me at open.intel.com and my colleagues. And we're there to share with the world our open source activities.
And I'm remembering,
so follow this space.
Yeah, I mean, back when open source was first coined, as robbed from the military as a word by the geeks, they robbed it, they took it away, which is great. Made the world talk about it. It was in 1998, now 24 years ago. Getting big companies that weren't open source already, like a Red Hat, to care about open source is a real chore. And now Intel has it, Adobe has it, lots of big companies have it. It's a really cool thing. So I'm glad for that. So thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was
We'll see you on our own show.
Incredibly lucky to have been part of this one. Yeah, I'll see you tomorrow on our
That's
own
the other
show.
plug that Katherine and I have our own show too. So that's at Reality 2Cast. So great having you, everybody. I'm Dr. Searls. I haven't looked at who we have next week. I should look real quickly. Oh my gosh, I always mean to do that and then I don't. Let me check the schedule. Oh wow, yeah, Jonathan Corbett of LW Analytics Weekly News. He's stayed on the case forever. A very important guy in the Linux world. So that's Jonathan Corbett. That's coming up next week. Be there. I'm Dr. Searls. This is FLOSS Weekly. See you then.
Hey, we should talk Linux. It's the operating system that runs the internet, a bunch of game consoles, cell phones, and maybe even the machine on your desk. You already knew all that. What you may not know is that TWiT now has a show dedicated to it, the Untitled Linux Show. Whether you're a Linux pro, a burgeoning sysadmin, or just curious what the big deal is, you should join us on the Club TWiT Discord every Saturday afternoon for news, analysis, and tips to sharpen your Linux skills. And then make sure you subscribe to the Club TWiT exclusive Untitled Linux Show. Wait, you're not a Club TWiT member yet? Well, go to twit.tv/clubtwit and sign up. Hope to see you there.